Today I'm going to focus on 3 of their biggest lies. Lie number 1, promoters of human rights like Harris claim human rights are a beacon of hope. Human rights are the mark of civilization and progress, and everyone should adopt human rights. But is this true? Do human rights bring prosperity and progress? 192 out of 195 countries of the world have officially adopted the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's 98% of all countries in the world. Do we see prosperity and progress in these countries? Let's look at the GDP per capita. North America is at $61,000 per capita. Western Europe is at $54,000 per capita. Australia and New Zealand are at about $55,000. These regions are at the top of the heap. It must be because they're so strong in terms of human rights and democracy, right? But let's compare that to Eastern Europe. Just $9,000 GDP per capita. Latin America is less than $7,400 per capita. India, the world's largest democracy, is only at $2,000. Sub-Saharan Africa is at $1,500. For Muslim countries, the average GDP per capita is $7,500. And if you exclude the oil-rich countries, the number is at $4,600. So when people want to say Muslim countries are economically behind because of lack of human rights, the reality is Muslim countries are at the same level as most of these human rights respecting countries. Why do countries like America, UK, Britain, Australia have 10 times, 20 times, 30 times the GDP per capita of countries in Latin America, Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa? Why this massive inequality? None of the countries in these regions are Muslim, and all of them respect and abide by human rights. Consider Botswana, considered one of the oldest democracies in the Southern Hemisphere, one of the earliest adopters of LGBT rights in Africa, very high female involvement with voting and politics, but it has only 1/10 the GDP per capita of the US. Or consider Haiti. They ratified their secular constitution in 1805, over 200 years ago. They had a female president in 1990. Their GDP per capita is 1/50th the United States, and on and on. On this other side of the coin, you have countries that have openly rejected human rights and democracy, like China, which has a GDP of $10,000, and Singapore, which has a GDP per capita of $65,000. So either way you look at it, there is no correlation between adoption of human rights and democracy with economic prosperity. Harris, you need to explain this. These countries that have nothing to do with Islam, that have adopted human rights and democracy and women's rights and LGBT rights, why are they stuck in abject poverty? Because you want to blame problems of poverty, problems of violence and social dysfunction on Islam. So how do you explain these countries that have nothing to do with Islam, that have these same problems and often worse problems? Why is it that human rights only brings prosperity for North America and Western Europe, and the majority of the rest of the world suffers? Better yet, explain why people living in human rights-abiding democracies in Latin America, in Africa, are literally dying to migrate to America and Western Europe. Why are they risking their lives to escape their human rights hellholes, Harris? Explain that. And we don't have to just limit ourselves to GDP. Look at the life expectancy. Latin America, Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africans have 5 to 15 years lower life expectancy. Those countries also reported far lower happiness levels. According to the UN's 2017 World Happiness Report, according to self-reported happiness, countries of North America and Western Europe have the highest levels of happiness, while Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Eastern Europe have the lowest levels. So why is this, Harris? None of these countries are Muslim countries. They're all democratic countries, secular countries. Some of them even have very high levels of atheism. So why aren't they enjoying progress and prosperity? Let's call this question the Botswana question. If Harris cannot explain these discrepancies, if he cannot answer this Botswana question, then he should admit that democracy and human rights are just a big hoax. Harris wants people to hate Islam by trying to pin the issue of poverty and social dysfunction to Muslim countries, but as we've seen, it's not a strong connection. Lie number 2, Harris wants to pretend like his problem.
Okay. So let me make a few remarks. Maybe some people didn't really understand what the significance of this question, the Botswana question, really is. The whole point of this question is to take out a typical argument that these human rights activists have. Their typical argument is that look at the relative levels of income and poverty and economics between the Muslim world and America, between the Muslim world and Canada, Muslim world and France and UK. Look at the big differences here. This shows that human rights, equality, democracy is a better system. Isn't that clear? Who can deny that more wealth is better, and the system that produces more wealth is a better system? So that argument, which Harris didn't really even give that argument. Because he started with his 16-minute opening, he didn't even attempt to bring stats to justify that on an economic basis. So he didn't even get to the first level of this conversation, like the first step. He couldn't even, make that argument. But it still stands. Like, this point that I'm making is still stands. That fine, you want to criticize the Muslim world for not being like the U.S. in terms of wealth, but so are all of these other human rights abiding countries, these democracies. So if you want to criticize Afghanistan, criticize El Salvador. If you want to criticize Afghanistan or Pakistan, also criticize the Ukraine, criticize Lesotho, criticize Botswana, and explain, like, okay, fine, these countries. So like the response that Harris could have made, he didn't really articulate it, but he could have said that no, Botswana has corruption. They're not really implementing human rights. Botswana is not really serious. Haiti, El Salvador, all of these countries that are economically 1/10, 1/20th, 1/30th the GDP of the West, they're not really serious about human rights the same way that America and Britain are serious about human rights. That's what I was anticipating that he would say, and a competent person would have made that kind of response, but he never even made that kind of response. But the response to that would have been to say that, well, why are these other countries basically 75% of the world is not serious about the values that they proclaim? It's only the West, it's only America and Canada, etc., that are serious people. Why? Why are people in Botswana not serious? Why are people in Botswana more corrupt or hypocritical? Why are people in Haiti and El Salvador, why are they advocating democracy and women's rights and LGBT and all of these human rights values? They advocate, but they're corrupt or they're not implementing them. Why? Explain that. You've just deferred the question, basically. If he had made that response, that's what I would have responded with. Like, you've only deferred the question. You haven't given us a real explanation. Unless you want to make like some kind of racial argument. You want to say that people other than in the US, people other than in the UK, people other than in France, they're just not as moral. People in Botswana are more immoral. They're more hypocritical. They, have lower intelligence. You can put the IQ question aside, okay, because that's a separate argument, and we can get into that too. There are plenty of responses to that, because some of these people will also point to IQ discrepancies between the West and the rest. And there are responses to that, but I knew Harris wouldn't give an IQ response. He wasn't going to give an IQ response. Why? Because he's a liberal soy boy type. Those are not the kind of arguments that they give. But there is a response to that kind of argument as well, because you'll say that, well, Muslims, we're not IQ fetishists. We don't think that whoever has higher IQ, which is basically analytic quantitative ability, whoever has higher IQ is going to be superior and is going to be more moral and is going to be more advanced and progressive. You're an IQ fetishist, and I'll argue that actually no, like unhinged quantitativeness, unhinged mathematical ability, scientific ability leads to atheism. It leads to a rejection of God. It leads to a rejection of many deontological values that are important, family values. And this is actually, many studies, psychological studies show this. And again, I will refer you to Genius of Islam episode 2, where I talk about analytic versus deontological reasoning. Analytic reasoning is correlated with higher IQ. So higher IQ means more analytic reasoning, which means less deontological reasoning, and deontological, not reasoning, but deontological psychology. And that leads to all kinds of problems in terms of family values, in terms of relationships, in terms of society overall. So we're not IQ fetishists, Muslims. Harris wasn't going to bring this kind of argument that the difference between Botswana or the West and the rest is IQ. He wasn't going to bring that. But if he were to bring that, I would just say that, well, you're being a racist, first of all, because you value people on the basis of this kind of discrepancy. And furthermore, I can concede that there are differences. I'm not sure about that. Okay, I'm not sure if there are major discrepancies in IQ between races that will explain 50 times difference in GDP. In fact, I think that doesn't make sense. I don't think that IQ discrepancies can explain that much of the gap. But I could even concede that. I could even concede this kind of IQ is everything analysis of the world, and and still be able to argue that Islam provides a better system that leads to better outcomes. We can make that argument, but that's not what Harris was going to argue, because I would just call him a racist. Also, let's just the other point that I want to make is that the answer that I believe, what is the real reason that I think there is this structural inequality, or this West versus the rest? It's because of colonialism. It's because of these weapons, these trillion-dollar weapons programs. It's because of this terroristic mindset of pure analysis, analytic reasoning above all else, above God, above religion, above truth, this utilitarian, materialistic, liberal ideology. That's the source. And again, Genius of Islam, episode 2. I keep plugging it because that will give you the information that you need in hopefully a digestible way. But that's the reason why we have these kinds of discrepancies, and it's not just Muslims that were affected, it's everyone that's affected. That's what explains the inequality. But Harris, of course, is not going to concede that. He can't concede that. He can't accept that, because then all of his criticisms of Islam are going to be undermined by that.
Move to Botswana or Haiti? Well, because human rights is not the only thing. It's just a part of the package. It's not the whole package. So there are so many other things that you want to get. Botswana and Haiti probably don't take refugees either. And why would you not want to go to a country where you can maximize pleasure and you live your life to its maximum?
So this response is incoherent. Like, it's the whole package, right? So what else in this package, like Botswana and Haiti and Lesotho and El Salvador, they don't have this whole package. Well, what is the whole package? You should know, right? Because you want to say that Muslim countries, they don't have the whole package either, but they're worse in your mind because they are Muslim, and their problems, all the problems of the Muslim world, can be blamed on Islam. But all of these problems in these other countries in the global south, it's because of some other factor, some mysterious other factor that we don't know. Why don't you tell us? What is this? What else in this package is necessary? Because all that you human rights advocates and liberals and neocons, whatever flavor of liberal you are, all these woke social justice leftists, they're also part of the larger liberal umbrella, the philosophy of the Enlightenment, the godless materialist philosophy. They're all under the same umbrella. What is this mysterious other factor? If it's not human rights, the woke liberals and feminists are agitating that we need more women's rights. If you have women's rights like we have in the West, or that we advocate for in the West, then suddenly the whole world will flourish and there will be prosperity and so forth. Okay, well, a lot of these countries do have women's rights. They have female presidents. A lot of these countries have female presidents, prime ministers. They have very high, like over 50% voting. A lot of them have even, like a lot of Muslim countries actually have, and I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but they have more women graduating with degrees in science and math and STEM. They have more degrees than the men graduating. Or these woke LGBT activists. Oh, if only the world would just treat the LGBT better, then there would be so much progress and flourishing, and the Africa would be at the same level of France and Canada and the UK. Is this really your argument? If see how ridiculous that sounds, but that's exactly what the US has been doing with their nation building. All of these NGOs that we laughed at and we heard about on the news over the past month. You had the gender and sexuality department in Kabul University, and there was this clip of showing conceptual art and feminist art to these Afghan women, trying to teach them about conceptual art and LGBT, and gender is just a social construct, and trans ideology. Why are you teaching all of that? Why are you spending millions and billions of dollars on nation building just through NGOs? You're trying to change the culture because this is like some magic formula, right? That once Afghanistan starts doing these things and becoming a true liberal democracy, then it's going to be like Sweden. It's going to be like France. It's going to be like Canada. There's just so much prosperity. If only they would adopt these human rights, these liberal values. That's what they need. That's the problem, right? Their problem is they're stuck with Islam instead of liberal human rights. That's the magic formula. Just adopt that and you'll be great. But that's not the case, because look at all these other counterexamples. Look at all these other counterexamples where they've done exactly, they have all of those same values. People in Botswana and Haiti, okay, in terms of their government, if you say LGBT, we should respect LGBT, they'll say, they won't have a religious objection to it. Okay, maybe not Haiti, because I think they have, they actually are not as pro-LGBT as some other countries. But just pick your country. Okay, there are plenty of these kinds of countries in the world. As 99%, 98% are endorsers of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Many of them have accepted, or they have legalized homosexuality, and they have legalized gay marriage, and they're going down the same path, right, of liberalization. So, but they're not like suddenly jumping up in terms of their GDP. So why is the magic formula not working? Harris's response is to say, well, there's more to the package. Well, what is it? Tell us. He wasn't able to do that because this is a con game. It's a hoax.
So I think that was easy to respond. Didn't take that long.